My name is Olivia Harris. I am 39 years old, and for years I paid every mortgage bill, every light and gas payment, believing family meant sacrifice. But a week before Christmas, I opened an email that nearly stole the only thing truly mine. My sister-in-law tried to sell my car using my name, and when my mother sided with her, I realized silence was no longer peace. That night, I decided to pull every record, every contract, every payment, and by Christmas Eve, their perfect celebration collapsed in the dark, while I finally sat in the light. It was the week before Christmas, when an email slid into my inbox at work. I clicked without thinking, expecting another holiday sale or an office memo. Instead, my breath caught in my throat. The message confirmed that paperwork had been filed to sell a 2019 Toyota Camry registered in my name. That was my car that I had driven every day from my apartment in Richmond to the logistics firm where I worked, my car that nobody else had any right to touch. I called the dealership listed in the message. My voice shook as I spelled out my name. The man on the other end typed paused and said yes. There was an active file showing a pending sale. I told him firmly that I had never signed anything. Another pause. He lowered his voice and said I should reach out to the DMV immediately. My palms were wet when I hung up. I hurried down the stairwell to the garage behind my building. The cabinet where I kept important documents was ajar. Folders slumped sideways. The envelope holding the original car title was ripped open. The paper itself was missing. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here and taken it. I knew whose hands it was in. Madison, my brother Daniel's wife. She had joked before that my car sat too long in the lot, that it was wasted on me. Now the joke had sharp edges. That evening I drove to my mother's house in Chesterfield County. Holiday lights glowed across the front porch, wreaths on every window. Inside, cinnamon hung in the air. Madison leaned against the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. Daniel stood beside her, arms folded. I walked in holding the printed email. My voice was steady as I asked if she knew anything about it. She looked up, smirked, and shrugged. "The car just sits there, Olivia. It is not doing anyone any good. You hardly drive it. Maybe it is time to let it go." Heat flared in my chest. I told her it was mine, the title in my name, and no one had the right to touch it. She tilted her head and smiled as if I was being childish. "Maybe the family should make decisions together," she said softly, almost sweet. I looked at Daniel. He avoided my eyes, staring down at the countertop. My mother walked in with a tray of cookies, set it down, and forced a bright smile. She asked how traffic had been, pretending not to hear a word. The silence between us was heavier than the decorations hanging from the ceiling. I pressed the paper tight in my fist. My voice dropped lower. "If you ever lay a hand on my car again, Madison, you will regret it." Her smile did not falter. Daniel stayed pressed against the counter arms, crossed his eyes still on the floor. I turned and walked out, the cold night air biting my face as soon as I stepped outside. The neighborhood sparkled with Christmas lights, laughter spilling from nearby houses. I stood by my Camry, ran my hand over the hood, and felt how much it meant to me. It was not just transportation. It was the one thing fully mine. The symbol of every long hour I had worked, every sacrifice I had made. And now it was the target of people who thought they could strip me of it without consequence. I slid into the driver's seat, the smell of pine from the old air freshener filling my lungs. My hands gripped the steering wheel. The betrayal was no longer a whisper or a suspicion. It was real, documented, and bold. I could not ignore it. The engine hummed as I started the car. Headlights cut across the driveway. Somewhere down the street, Christmas music floated through the air, cheerful but empty. I stared at the road ahead and felt something harden inside me. If they thought I would stay silent, they were wrong. I knew the next step would be to gather proof, to make sure when the time came, there would be no way for them to deny what they had done. I pulled onto the street, the tires crunching softly over the cold pavement, already knowing this Christmas would be nothing like the ones before. The city lights blurred through my windshield as I drove back toward my apartment. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and I could feel every sacrifice I had made pressing down on me. For 5 straight years, I had covered the mortgage on my mother's house in Chesterfield, $1,650, leaving my account each month without fail. I had set up automatic payments for the utilities too, $300 to $400 depending on the season, so that the lights stayed on and the heat never stopped running. The deed was in my mother's name, but the burden had been mine. I used to tell myself it was temporary. Rebecca was a retired school teacher. Daniel was still getting his footing. Madison always said her event planning business would take off any day. I believed them because I wanted to believe family meant something. Month after month I kept paying, even when it meant skipping vacations, even when I packed lunch from home while my coworkers went out. What stung most was not just the money, but the way it was treated as invisible. My mother never asked if I could manage. Daniel strutted through family dinners talking about new gadgets he wanted to buy, and she laughed like he deserved them. Madison once showed off a designer coat, and when I raised an eyebrow, she said Daniel had gotten a holiday bonus. Nobody mentioned the mortgage check that had cleared from my account that same week. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table the Christmas before watching Daniel tear into gifts, while my own present sat unopened at the edge. Rebecca had leaned over and said quietly that Daniel always carried so much stress that it was nice to see him smile. I bit back words, then telling myself peace was better than conflict. But now, after seeing Madison's smirk in the kitchen and the title envelope torn open, silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like surrender. The car was not just a possession. It was the one thing standing between me and complete dependence on people who already erased me from their picture of family. I pulled into my apartment lot and sat there with the engine running. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. It read only one line: "Do not overreact." I stared at the words until they blurred. Overreact. As if working 60-hour weeks covering their roof, their heat, their water while they plotted to sell. The one thing in my name was a small thing. I shut off the car and carried my bag upstairs. The apartment was quiet, just the low hum of the fridge. I opened my laptop, pulled up my bank records, and scrolled through the payments. Line after line, the mortgage was drafted like clockwork since January 2018. My name was printed neatly beside each transaction. It was all there, undeniable. The anger inside me cooled into something sharper. For years I had hidden these numbers like they were shameful, like admitting how much I carried would make me sound bitter. Now I saw them differently. They were proof. Proof that I was not crazy. Proof that I had kept that house alive while they pretended it was theirs. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. Outside snow flurries spun under the streetlight. My breath fogged the glass when I leaned close to the window. The neighborhood across the way was glowing with strings of lights, laughter carrying faintly. I thought about Rebecca's face in the kitchen, the way she had turned away from me, as if cookies could erase what Madison had done. I whispered into the empty room, "Never again." My voice sounded steady, almost unfamiliar. The old version of me would have buried this, would have swallowed the anger, and told herself family was complicated. But I knew the next move had to be different. The ripped envelope, the dealership file, the bank records, all of it pointed in one direction. I needed to gather every piece of evidence before they tried to rewrite the story again. And I already knew exactly who I could trust to help me take the next step. I drove across town to a small apartment complex on the north side of Richmond where my cousin Chloe lived. She was 26, a second-year law student at the University of Virginia Satellite Program, and one of the only people in the family who ever seemed to notice how much I carried. When she opened the door, her eyes darted nervously down the hall before she let me in. We sat at her kitchen table, a stack of case books piled high on one end, and I laid the dealership email between us. Chloe chewed her lip, her hands twisting in her lap. Finally, she whispered that Madison had asked her about legal templates a week ago. Chloe had brushed it off until she saw a copy of my car registration on Madison's desk when she stopped by my mother's house. The signature line was filled in with my name, but the handwriting was wrong. My pulse thudded in my ears. Chloe reached into her phone and showed me the photo she had snapped. A blurry copy, but enough to see the forged scrawl. She told me quietly not to mention her name, that if Madison knew she had shared it, there would be hell to pay. I promised to protect her, though inside I burned with rage. It was one thing for Madison to make smug comments about my car, it was another to forge my signature. That was fraud. I asked Chloe if she had seen anything else. She nodded and pulled up another screen. It was a confirmation email from a local appraisal service scheduled for later that week, tied to Madison's personal email address. My car had already been booked for evaluation. The room felt suddenly smaller. I gripped the edge of the table, fighting the urge to slam my fist against it. Chloe placed her hand on mine and told me to breathe. She reminded me that the law was on my side. Still, the betrayal spread through me like ice water. Later that evening, I drove back to my mother's house. Rebecca was in the living room stringing garland. Daniel sat on the couch with the game on low volume. I stood in the doorway, the photo of the forged title glowing on my phone screen. I told them calmly what I had found. Rebecca's hands kept moving, looping ribbon as if she had not heard me. Daniel barely glanced away from the television. He muttered that Madison was probably just trying to help, that I was overblowing the situation. I stared at both of them, waiting for someone to show an ounce of concern that a crime was being committed in our own family. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. My mother hummed softly to herself, her back turned, and Daniel clicked the remote like the conversation was finished. I walked out, my chest tight. In the driveway, my breath fogged the cold air. It was clear now. Madison was not acting alone. By ignoring me, by refusing to even acknowledge what I had shown them, they had chosen her side. I sat behind the wheel of my car, the photo of the forged title still open on my phone. Chloe's warning echoed in my head. Keep me out of it. I knew she was right to be afraid, but fear was no longer an option for me. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. If they thought I was powerless, they had underestimated me. I would gather every document, every receipt, every record. And soon, I would place all of it where no one could deny the truth again. The next morning, I walked into a brick office building on Main Street, where my cousin Nathan had his practice. He was 40 now, a contract attorney, who had always been the practical one at family gatherings. When he saw the stack of papers in my arms, his brow furrowed. We sat across his desk, holiday decorations taped crookedly on the wall behind him, and I laid out the printouts of my bank records, the photo Chloe had taken of the forged registration, and the appraisal confirmation in Madison's name. Nathan flipped through the pages carefully, his jaw tightening. He tapped the photo of the fake title. That is fraud, Olivia. If she ever tries to use this at the DMV or at a dealer, she could face serious charges. He looked me in the eye and told me the car, the mortgage, the utilities, the insurance, every account was under my name. I had complete authority. For the first time in weeks, my breath eased a little. He made a copy of the forged document and told me to keep it secure. He would hold the copy in case I needed a witness. Then he leaned forward and said if Madison submitted anything, I should immediately alert the DMV. His tone was steady, matter of fact, the way only an attorney could sound when the ground felt shaky beneath me. Later that afternoon, I met David Howard for coffee downtown. David had been a friend from my early career, now a labor lawyer in his 50s. I trusted his bluntness. I showed him the same stack of records. He shook his head slowly, his gray hair catching the winter light. He told me what Nathan had already said, that the accounts gave me full control. He reminded me that while Rebecca's name was on the deed of the house, the mortgage was mine. Without me, the house would not stand. His words settled like iron in my chest. That night, I spread everything out on my dining table. Bank statements, receipts, contracts, utility bills, copies of emails. I labeled a folder on my laptop, proof, and dragged scanned images inside one by one. Each click steadied me. The weight of years I had carried in silence was now lined neatly in files undeniable. While I was filing the last statement, my phone buzzed. A voicemail notification from my mother. I hesitated before pressing play. Her voice filled the room, calm and clipped. Olivia, selling the car is the right thing to do. Do not make this difficult. My hands shook as I set the phone down. There was no apology, no question if I was all right. only a verdict cold as a gavel. I sat in the quiet staring at the folder glowing on my laptop screen. Proof. The word looked different now. I had the law on my side, yet my own family had stripped me of recognition. It was not just Madison's scheme anymore. It was my mother's voice telling me to stand aside. I leaned back in the chair, the hum of the heater filling the silence. My anger no longer burned hot. It had cooled into something precise like the sharp edge of glass. If they would not acknowledge me, then I would make sure the truth itself could not be denied. I closed the laptop and stood at the window, watching snow scatter under the street lamp. My reflection stared back harder than before. I whispered to myself that it was time to use the authority they pretended I did not have. The phone buzzed again on the table, Daniel's name flashing this time. I did not pick up. I already knew what side he stood on. Instead, I reached for the stack of folders and slid them into my bag. The next move was already clear in my mind, and once it began, there would be no turning back. I sat at my desk the next morning and logged into my online banking. My finger hovered over the settings for the mortgage autopay. Every month since 2018, it had drafted like clockwork, draining my account to keep my mother's house standing. I clicked cancel, and a confirmation box appeared. "Are you sure?" I typed yes. My chest tightened as the green checkmark flashed across the screen. Next, I opened my email. I drafted a message to the bank attaching proof of my payments over the years, and a clear statement that I was suspending all future drafts. My name, my account, my decision. The reply came within the hour, a polite acknowledgement that my request had been received. From there, I called Dominion Energy. My voice did not shake as I asked the representative to schedule a disconnect for the evening of December 24th. He confirmed the date and told me the cutoff would occur between 6 and 9 that night. I wrote the confirmation number on a notepad. I repeated the process with the gas company and the internet provider, each time hearing the same neutral voice confirming that my request would be honored. By the time I hung up the last call, my hands were steady. For years I had been the silent provider. Now I was the one pulling the plug. I leaned back and thought about the party Rebecca had been planning. Madison bragged that she had arranged catering from a popular downtown restaurant, that a DJ was booked, that the decor would be perfect for photographs. All of it had been put on my card because the family insisted I was so good with money. I opened my email folder and pulled up the contracts. I sent 3 short messages. Each one canceled. Each one received an automatic response confirming termination. 5 days before the event, there was no going back. The phone buzzed against the table as I was closing my laptop. The caller ID showed a local number I recognized but had not seen in years. Rachel Myers from the Richmond Gazette. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was brisk. She said she had received a tip from the neighborhood association about financial irregularities tied to Rebecca's name in a recent charity drive. She asked if I had anything to share. I swallowed hard and said only that I was not ready to comment. Rachel told me she understood, but her tone suggested she already had more than she was letting on. She promised accuracy if I ever wanted to go on record. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat in silence. The thought of Rebecca's perfect image cracking in public should have felt triumphant. Instead, it left me strangely calm. I had carried their weight so long that even revenge felt quiet. The proof I had built, the cancellations I had confirmed, they were all steps in a process that had only just begun. That evening, I walked through my apartment collecting the physical copies of everything I had saved. Receipts, mortgage statements, utility bills all slid neatly into folders. I stacked them on the table, my name shining on every page. My reflection in the window looked steadier than it had in years. The snow outside thickened as I turned off the lights. My phone buzzed again, a message from Daniel asking if I would be coming to the party after all. I deleted it without reading further. I had already chosen my role in the night ahead, and they would not see it coming. The night of December 24th came cold and sharp, the kind of winter air that settled deep into your lungs. From my apartment window, I could see the street glowing with Christmas lights, families moving in and out of houses carrying gifts and food. I knew across town my mother's house was full, her big tree lit up in the front room, cars lining the driveway. I pictured guests in coats and dresses, Madison floating from room to room, playing hostess Daniel, nodding with a drink in his hand. Rebecca smiling, as if everything was perfect. I sat on my couch with a blanket draped over my lap, my phone on the table buzzing occasionally with messages I did not open. I made tea and let it cool as I watched the snow drift past the glass. Somewhere in that house music was playing, children were laughing, and plates were clinking. At just after 7, the first alert came in. A text from a neighbor who lived on the same street as my mother. Power just went out. A second later, another followed. Do you know what happened? I set the phone face down and sipped my tea. In my mind, I saw the living room suddenly dark, the chandelier overhead clicking silent guests, startled, as the tree lights went black. A few minutes later, the gas furnace would shut off the hum of heat, replaced by a chill creeping into the corners. Internet routers would blink dead music cutting mid-song. The next round of messages stacked quickly. Madison freaking out. Daniel calling the power company. Rebecca yelling at someone on the phone. I kept the screen dim, only glancing at the words. One cousin wrote that the catering truck never arrived. Guests stood waiting with empty plates, while Madison tried to explain. The restaurant told them the contract had been canceled 5 days earlier. Another message came from my aunt, her words clipped. What is going on, Olivia? I let it pass unread. I imagined Madison pacing, cheeks flushed, whispering to Daniel that she had everything under control. Daniel shaking his head, phone pressed to his ear, only to be told the account holder had requested disconnection. Rebecca gripping the receiver of the landline, her voice rising, the representative repeating politely that the request had come from Olivia Harris. Children began to cry, bundled into coats as their parents gathered belongings. Guests muttered as they shuffled toward the door, their shadows flickering by candlelight. Outside, the street glowed with neighbors peering from windows, some stepping onto porches to watch the commotion. In my apartment, the only sound was the clock on the wall and the faint hiss of the radiator. My tea had gone cold, but I held the mug anyway, the warmth of earlier lingering in the ceramic. My phone buzzed non-stop, names flashing across the screen. Daniel, Rebecca numbers I did not recognize. I left it on the table. By 9 o'clock, the stream of messages slowed. One final text from a cousin read that half the guests had left. The rest sat in coats waiting for someone to fix it. I closed my eyes and pictured the dining table covered in dishes that were growing cold candles dripping wax onto tablecloths, the proud image of my mother's perfect Christmas collapsing in real time. I stood at the window, pulled the curtain back, and looked out at the snow thickening on the street. A car passed slowly, tires crunching over the icy pavement. The air outside was silent, but inside me, there was a steady hum. For the first time, I felt a calm I could trust. The phone buzzed again, louder against the wood. Rebecca's name glowing in bold letters. I let it ring until it stopped. I knew that whatever she said next would not be an apology. It would be something else entirely, and I would be ready for it. Christmas morning broke with a pale sun pushing through the blinds of my apartment. I brewed coffee and flipped open my laptop, the steam rising into the still air. The headline on the Richmond Gazette homepage froze me in place. Community leader removed from charity board, after questions about finances. My mother's name appeared halfway down the article. Rebecca Harris had stepped aside from her position with the neighborhood fund after irregularities were discovered in donation records. The story mentioned a review was ongoing. There was no photo of her smiling at a banquet, no praise for years of service, just silence where her reputation had once lived. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the bitterness fill my mouth. My phone chimed again with an alert, this time from the bank. A message in bold letters informed me the mortgage tied to the Chesterfield house was now officially past due. They requested immediate action by the listed occupants to assume or refinance the loan. Without my payments, the house stood on shaky ground. By noon, the messages from cousins rolled in like a tide. One said Madison's friends had confronted her about the forged paperwork. Another claimed she was locked out of a group chat that morning. The circles she had worked so hard to impress were closing their doors. I pictured her pacing with her phone, trying to explain, trying to twist the story, and finding no one willing to listen. Later that afternoon, Daniel's name lit my phone. I let it ring out, then listened to the voicemail. His voice was tight, lower than usual. He said I had embarrassed the family, that people at his dealership whispered behind his back, that customers asked questions about his integrity. He ended with silence, as if waiting for me to respond, even through the recording. I deleted it without saving. The knock at my door startled me. I opened it to find Norma Jenkins standing there, bundled in her thick coat, a plate of cookies balanced in her hands. She was 68, retired from teaching years ago, and had always greeted me with a wave when we crossed paths in the hall. She stepped inside, her eyes gentle, and placed the plate on my counter. I told her she did not have to bring anything, but she only shook her head. "People talk," she said quietly. "You are stronger than they ever gave you credit for." She patted my arm once and left me standing in the kitchen with the smell of sugar filling the room. As evening fell, I sat on the couch, scrolling through unread messages. One stood out. It was from my mother. "We are still family." That was all it said. No mention of the board position, no mention of the mortgage notice, no acknowledgement of what Madison had done. Just the same cold attempt to bind me back into silence. I saved the message, set the phone face down, and leaned back. The weight that used to sit heavy in my chest felt different now. I was no longer carrying them. The balance had shifted, and they were the ones scrambling to hold on. Outside, snow gathered on the streetlights, and the world grew quiet. I knew there was still one final step before the door could close completely, and I was already preparing myself to take it. The first business day after Christmas, I drove to the bank in downtown Richmond with a folder of documents tucked under my arm. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and pine leftover garlands still strung along the counters. I sat with a loan officer and slid the paperwork across the desk. My name was on every mortgage statement, every utility bill, every insurance record. Rebecca's name sat only on the deed. I signed the assumption forms to remove myself entirely from liability. The officer stamped them with a heavy thud and told me the process would finalize in a matter of weeks. As I walked out into the winter air, my shoulders felt lighter than they had in years. At home, I placed the stamped forms into my folder labeled Proof. Next to them were the photos of Madison's forged signature, the appraisal email, the bank records. I kept them filed neatly, but knew I no longer needed to wield them. Their own actions had already exposed them. The silence from their side was louder than any confession. When I returned to work after the holiday break, coworkers greeted me warmly. A few had seen the article in the Gazette. No one asked for details, but there was a quiet respect in the way my manager paused at my desk and told me I had always been steady, that not everyone had that kind of strength. For once, I did not feel invisible. In the following weeks, the neighborhood grapevine carried the rest of the story. Rebecca rarely left her house. Madison's reputation among her friends dissolved. Daniel kept his head down at the dealership where sales numbers dropped, and whispers followed him from the lot to the office. People knew. They knew who had been carrying the weight and who had been taking advantage. One Saturday morning, I sat in my apartment with a fresh cup of coffee steam curling into the air. Snow fell in slow flakes outside, layering the cars in the lot with white. I leaned against the window, watching children below laugh as they tried to build a lopsided snowman. My reflection stared back at me, calmer, firmer. I thought of the years I had believed love meant silence, that family meant endless sacrifice. I had been erased from their stories, even as I held the roof over their heads. Taking back control had not destroyed them. They had destroyed themselves when they chose greed over gratitude. I raised the mug and whispered into the quiet, I did not break them. I only stopped giving them access to me. The truth settled in my chest like warmth after a long storm. If you have ever been dismissed in your own family, if you have carried burdens no one acknowledged, I want to ask you something. Where is your line? At what point does sacrifice stop being love and start being surrender? Share your story, because sometimes justice begins the moment you finally stop giving without end.